Right. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the Lowy Institute. I'm Shruti Pandale, the inaugural India chair here at the Institute, and I started out in May earlier this year. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which the Institute stands, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. The conversation today that we're having here at the Lowy Institute is about why India matters to Australia's economic and strategic future. And more importantly, what that really means in practical terms for business, policy, and national capability. It's my pleasure really to have this conversation with Dhruva Jaishankar, who is the 2026 inaugural recipient of the Ram Sethi Fellowship. We at Lowy would like to acknowledge the Prabhat Sethi family who have made Dhruva's fellowship possible. I'm sure many of you in the room here know Dhruva, but for the benefit of the room, a quick introduction is in order. Dhruva is the executive director of the Observer Research Foundation America, a public policy think tank based out of Washington, D.C., which he helped establish in 2020. In this capacity, he also serves as the Vice President Americas at the ORF, which is an influential think tank based out of Delhi since 2025. He's the author of the Vishwa Shastra, India and the World, which is an introduction in many ways to Indian foreign policy and international relations. And he's also a non-resident fellow here at the Lowy Institute and the 2026 Senior Fellow with the Asia-New Zealand Foundation. Today, we're very lucky to have Dhruva here with us, who's been with the India chair and program for the last couple of weeks, and we've had some very interesting conversations both here in Sydney and as we have traveled out to Canberra for many such discussions and other public events. Let me start this conversation by sort of stating the context for why this conversation matters in many ways. The immediate prompt, of course, as all of you are aware, is Prime Minister Modi's visit to the country in July earlier this month. His third visit to Australia, really, after he took over as the Indian Prime Minister back in 2014. For me, in many ways, it's a great opportunity to ride out the momentum of that visit, to talk about why India matters, sort of understand where India literacy is at in many of the conversations when we have about the bilateral relationship. But for me, it was also very high on optics, of course, but also very substantive in terms of outcomes. And I think in many ways, I've been saying, this is his third visit, but it was perhaps the most unglamorous one. And I say that coming from a good place, because if 2014 in many ways was the reset in the relationship in terms of rapprochement, and many of the room are here for making that happen. 2020 saw the real upgrade in terms of a comprehensive strategic partnership. And 2023, what is it? And now this visit in 2026, what it's really done is sort of taken and all that convergence and political ambition and really found many ways to see that through in practical implementation delivery terms. So that in many senses, it is the operationalization piece of the partnership that many in this room have really worked hard towards. The outcomes were really significant because they sit at the intersection of economics and security. Australia and India have sort of moved to operationalize the long-discussed civil nuclear cooperation almost a decade later through uranium exports. There's advanced cooperation on critical minerals, cyber, emerging technologies, maritime security roadmap. For many of us in the room, talking about what India and Australia can converge all they want on defense and security, but what does that really mean in practical terms? I think that joint roadmap really sets the way forward. Lots of work to be done on moving the ECTA, or the interim trade agreement, to a comprehensive economic agreement, also discussed by the leaders. But some advancements on the space cooperation domain as well. But I think it also tells you a little bit about the operationalization piece that I hope to discuss with Dhruva. For India, in many ways, Australia has gone beyond just a conversational topic to becoming an operational partner. You're seeing energy, supply chains, defense, education, technology, and capital sort of becoming the big gives in the relationship. But the harder question is, we talk about convergence, we talk about where this partnership is going, but really where all of this becomes a proof of concept in the business case. Does all this conversation around uranium really translate into volumes? Does critical minerals go beyond the corridor and manage, the processing cost frictions? Can education skills in diaspora really become this economic infrastructure that we are talking about and go beyond people-to-people warmth in many ways? And all this talk of defense industry becoming a sunrise sector, will it really produce commercial outcomes? So we have a lot of ground to cover today. So Dhruva, buckle up. Let me start with, why should Australia consider India mission critical for its economic future? If you are talking to many ways an Australian board an investor who has a certain perception of India as being difficult, distant, or really why is that a clear option? What is the clearest economic case you will make for taking India seriously now?
Thank you, Shruti. You start with an easy one. First just want to say thank you to the Lowy Institute for hosting me. They've been very generous, the staff and associates of the Lowy Institute and the board have been very supportive of my being here. I've been here for a month, which is actually longer. I've come to Australia many times. It's always these very short 1 week trips, but the cliche used to be that India-Australia relations were characterized by Commonwealth, cricket, and curry. My experience has been more Bondi, Bluey, and Barnaby Joyce, I suppose. So it's it's been a much more immersive experience, and I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot in the process. Being here for a month, and we were just in Canberra, has allowed me to meet everyone from the Prime Minister's office to business and financial institutions here to the media. So it's really been quite immersive. Your question, why India? Why now? In some ways, so my commute every day, I walk down Martin Place nearby. And Martin Place, by the way, is where they filmed The Matrix, the movie. And there's a scene in The Matrix, which if you watch it, you'll recognize Martin Place here, where Morpheus is explaining The Matrix to Neo, and this woman in a red dress walks past. And in some ways, Australia is like The Matrix. It's this wonderful, beautiful, place. The weather in Sydney is always nice. The troubles of the world, the war in Iran and Ukraine, it all seems so far away, right? And then you scratch the surface on this world, this very comfortable world where we're all going out and getting coffee and enjoying ourselves and going surfing. But you scratch the surface on that world, and the world is a really messy place right now. And you just think about political developments in the United States. We have Mike Green here from the U.S. Studies Center. He can explain all about it. Or he doesn't want to explain all about it. You have a China that is in some ways projecting normalcy, but a lot of challenges under the surface, not least, again, what people talk about in the Taiwan contingency and security concerns in the South China Sea, but also industrial overcapacity and the consequences that's happening for economies around the world. You have changing technology, which is leading to very difficult questions, and I was following the discussions around some of the AI regulations here in Australia. And I haven't even mentioned the war in Iran and the war in Ukraine, right? And you take all of this together, and the world is a messy, disorderly place. Global disorder is perhaps the two words I've heard the most in the past month when I talk to Australian planners. So why India? I think in a relative scheme of things, India offers a certain degree of stability and predictability. You have at least a leadership that has been in power for 12 years at the national level, likely to see through the rest of its term, the next 3 years. We may look back on this as a sort of unprecedented period of relative political stability in India. You have an economy that's growing at 6.5% in the last year. It could be better, but in the relative scheme of things, pretty good. One of the fastest growing top 10 economies, G20 economies. It's, again, demographically, the demographic dividend in India is coming to an end very soon and perhaps sooner than expected, but it's still a relatively youthful and growing growing population. And there's some also positive signs on the industrial side as well, particularly in the last 5 years. On defense, India is now a defense importer of some significance. I wrote something about this recently for the Lowy Institute. In terms of Australia-India relations, again, it's a good news story. Since 2022 and the ECTA trade agreement that came into force, you now have $50 billion of annual trade. India is already Australia's 5th largest trade partner and may soon surpass South Korea and Japan to be the 3rd largest trade partner, although well below the United States and China. You have 1 million Indians in Australia, 4% of the population. So if you take all of this together, I see plenty of reasons why Australia and India need to be looking at each other and taking each other more seriously. Geography is another factor. Both Australia and India in their own ways are committed multilateralists, and at a time when the multilateral order is also under fray, under stress, there's need to coordinate, whether it's at the United Nations, at the G20, at the ASEAN Plus summits. There is a greater degree of coordination between the two. So I see plenty of reasons for why Australia needs to be taking India more seriously at this point of time, and Australian business in particular.
Dhruva, that's the convergence and the logic. But if there's something that, I'd push you to sort of tell us, what you think is most misunderstood about how India's business ecosystem operates?
So, I think the changes have been so rapid in the Australia-India relationship and within India that it's not always been as well appreciated here. And I think perhaps, you have, sort of 3 categories of people in Australia, particularly in the business community. You have those who've never been to India and who look at it as just, they look at the numbers, they look, and that's fine. That's how a lot of business operates. I think the most skeptical are those who have been to India, but, 15, 20 years ago. And they were often burned in past business ventures and with good reason are skeptical of going back in. But sometimes they're not appreciative of some of the changes that have taken place, particularly in the last, I would say in manufacturing in the last 5 years, in other areas maybe a little longer. I was talking to some business leaders, we were talking to them earlier today, and one factor I mentioned, India has built 90 new airports in the last 10 years. And that elicited some interest. But that's just one data point. I think there are those, though, that have gone recently, have experienced it. They no longer see India as just a place for low-cost services labor, which is, I think, the common perception of a lot of Australian businesses until quite recently. They actually see innovation taking place in certain sectors. They see a sort of greater dynamism and opportunity. I'll give you one example. There's an Australian Sydney-based company called AirTrunk. And they've made a $30 billion investment in commitment to India until 2030, strangely backed by a US company and Canadian pension funds. So maybe there's a message there for Australian supers as well, that they could get in on that action.
Right. Dhruva, you mentioned trade, and we've seen that the ECTA really helped push some of those trade numbers that you're talking about. Both leaders, for the 3rd time this time, reaffirmed the commitment of delivering on the CECA. Where do you think it's really stuck? Do you think there are timelines around which maybe businesses would like to plan, or that's something that's still going to be held back for a considerable period?
So I don't know about timelines. India has signed 8 trade agreements in the past 5-6 years. The most significant one this year was with the European Union, which is quite a difficult negotiation. Australia has also been negotiating with the EU. The UK-India FTA came into force earlier this year, a month or 2 ago. New Zealand has been finalized. So I do think it's possible a lot of the same issues that are coming up in the Australia-India negotiations have been addressed in other negotiations. India-Canada is underway. It'll probably take another year or so. My understanding is there are 3 big obstacles right now. One, probably the easiest, is some investment provisions that India would like to see some commitments on inbound investment from Australia. Secondly is agriculture, which is always difficult. Australia has a very competitive agricultural sector. India still has small-scale farming, which is both politically sensitive but also a big employer. So I think that those negotiations are difficult. And then mobility as well. And that's so I think those are the 3 factors that are holding things back. Trade negotiations, I've learned sometimes the hard way, are not bound often by political timetables. So I think we need to give space to for the negotiators to actually iron out some of these differences. But I do given the movement in these other negotiations that I mentioned, I'm reasonably optimistic that there should be forward progress in the next year or so.
Right. Dhruva, you mentioned Australian supers, and we were at the business and economic reception that Ryan Neelam is here, the CEO, and he organized this extremely exceptional event which got business leaders together during Prime Minister Modi's visit. And we saw, perhaps in many ways, a call to action by the Prime Minister making this business case for India in Australia. He said something about the Australian supers, and you and I have discussed this. When we talk about the 500 million figure, I think it's modest. You think it's a sign of good things to come. But he called it a marker of strategic trust going forward. So when you look at this investment or this flow of capital towards India, do you still, can we see them as early signals, or it's still a test case scenario?
I mean, the direction is positive, but just to give you a sense of the numbers, the recent announcement was for a $500 million investment by Australian Super, the largest fund in Australia, into NIIF, the National Infrastructure Investment Fund in India. Again, meaningful. It's a second tranche. The first tranche is actually, I believe, one of Australian Super's fastest, best performing infrastructure investments anywhere in the world. So it does represent, I think, a doubling down and a meaningful doubling down of that investment. But the total amount that Australian Super has in India is $3.3 billion. And just by comparison, I think it has about roughly $150 billion in North America and about $80 billion in Europe. Not very much in other developing markets, not much in Southeast Asia, not much in mainland China, surprisingly. But still, relative to Europe and mature markets, Europe, North America, it's still very low. And so I think that appetite for risk could increase. One of the common concerns is, well, lack of political stability. But again, if you see what's happening in the United States, I'm not sure. So I do think that there's room for growth. But again, some of this is not driven by governments. There's the limitations of what the Australian government can do on this. And I think that's something that India needs to understand a little bit better, that this is really driven by the business case and driven by members and who are investors in the mutual fund.
Right. One of the other places that the joint statement delivered was, as we discussed, the uranium piece and the critical corridors piece, critical minerals corridors piece. Where do you see this actually, beyond the rhetoric, and the governments have done their bits? Where would the actual volume come from?
So, one reason India takes interest in Australia is a resource powerhouse. It is sitting on I don't need to say it in this room. It's just it is a major player in that space, and I think actually you need to start on some of the less sexy areas, which is like iron ore, bauxite, copper, all of which the demand in India is growing. India is already the second largest producer of of steel in the world after China. China is by far the largest. India is the second. It is the second largest producer of aluminium. Its demands for both of those things and copper are only going to increase. And until now, India has been mostly looking at domestic iron ore facilities. Australia is already the number one foreign supplier, but the volumes are still relatively modest. And I think that is going to grow. So I think even before we get to critical minerals, there's a lot more that can be done in the mining sector. Uranium is, of course, the other area because, again, India has very large ambitions to grow its civil nuclear sector. The reforms that were legislated late last year, it's called the Shanti Act in India, has essentially made India's liability law in alignment with global standards, and that has essentially de-risked, for investors, has made it easier. What the latest agreement does on uranium is essentially allows the Indian, it creates a pathway for uranium exports, essentially by allowing the governments to step out of the way. And so now the business case needs to be made for the export of Australian uranium to India. But critical minerals is the subject everyone is talking about. Even in the Trump administration, the United States has put a lot of emphasis on this. There are multiple initiatives underway, multilateral initiatives. There's something called FORGE. There's a G7 Plus initiative that Canada and France have taken a leadership role in. There's something a less known initiative between Australia, Canada, and India called ACITI, ACITI. You can pronounce it the Italian way, aciti. Sounds like a pasta. But there are multiple initiatives underway to now move this forward, but still a lot more talk than action. And again, the challenge is really about the very peculiar economics of critical minerals. It requires prior offtake arrangements. The capital costs are exceedingly high. There are challenges to workforce. There are challenges to environmental considerations. So again, translating the ambition into reality anywhere in the world is proving very difficult. India's demands are going to grow. I suspect we'll see some announcements before the end of the year. The Indian government they have a critical mineral plan. The ambition is to set up processing facilities in coastal regions in India, particularly focused on the critical minerals required for renewable energy. So lithium will be one, and of course Australia is a major exporter of lithium. I suspect we'll get nickel, cobalt. So those will be the priority areas, and hopefully translating into others. And the demands will be in a few other areas: defense adjacent critical minerals. Semiconductor adjacent as part of India's semiconductor mission. India is getting in on the semiconductor supply chain. And then a little bit in solar panels as well, particularly quartz and other things. All of these are areas that China has really cornered the market, particularly processing. And so the more diversification that is underway, the better. But like a lot of other industrial activities, everyone is trying to get pieces of that action. And it's very hard to coordinate and this is where the multilateral element comes in, coordinating priorities amongst the different players, all of whom have a shared interest ultimately in diversifying critical mineral supply chains.
Big headline items were really around uranium, but there's also a clean energy opportunity and conversation to be had between our countries. So, we heard a lot on solar, storage supply chains, hydrogen, grid technology, etc. But when you're talking to the Australian audience, especially the business community, where's the real opportunity to capture?
I mean, again, the challenge is India is a large and diversified market with very high needs. There's been a lot of progress on the energy generation side, but less on the distribution, and that's sometimes due to state-level undercapacity and underinvestment. Some of it has to do with the economics of energy distribution in India. But generation has been a very good story, and India has a sort of all-of-the-above energy strategy, which is transitioning more and more into cleaner and greener energy sources. Traditionally, it's been very coal and oil driven, and it will continue to be for the foreseeable future. India's coal demands are actually growing, not reducing. At the same time, natural gas is seen as a transition, and so we are seeing much more in terms of LNG and LPG imports into India. Again, a little known story, India is now one of the largest refiners of petroleum products, and therefore a net exporter of petrol. It provides including to Australia, to New Zealand increasingly. So it's no longer just one-way traffic. India is importing crude from other places, but now exporting elsewhere. But renewables, I think, will be the future. So we've seen a massive solar plan. Again, very dependent on Chinese imports, but there has been a big success there. And wind to a lesser degree. Wind, the challenges are it's very seasonal. So in the monsoon, wind is a very good supplier, but off-season, it's very difficult. That gets us into storage and grid-scale storage and things like that. So for looking at it from Australia's point of view, every part of India's energy strategy has a potential Australian element: coal, gas, renewable critical minerals required for the renewable sector. Every element has potential for Australia. I think we're running into issues we have in the past with natural gas off of Western Australia, which is just about the pricing, it has traditionally been too expensive. It'll be interesting to see the long-term effects of the Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. India depends particularly on Qatar for natural gas and the United States, but it will now start actively looking for other sources. Do the economics now of natural gas exports from Australia to India make more sense going forward?
Right, and sticking to sort of the energy conversation, like we said, some of the uranium export flows into India are also about the AI capacity lift. So where do you think that sort of energy conversation should be seen in that context in terms of the AI opportunity?
So there's been a bit of a gold rush on AI data centers in India. There's been about $70 billion from just 4 companies in the United States in data centers between now and 2030. AWS, Microsoft, Google, and Meta, between them, have committed pretty sizable amounts. One of the big demands is making these energy efficient. It's been interesting again to see what Australia, just as Australia pioneered some of the social media regulations for miners, it's been interesting to see on AI obliging data centers to be net energy export or net grid providers, putting the onus on the private sector. Whether that works here in India, I think that's being probably looked at very closely. But for India, again, the demand is going to be quite high, and that's where nuclear energy has suddenly become more of greater interest. The idea, and this is still a few years away, of having small modular nuclear reactors that can help power some of these data centers is very appealing. Again, a lot of it can be done with renewables, but storage still remains a major constraint, and the entire battery supply chain is really cornered by China. It's very hard to move that, to de-risk that. And so I think that becomes part of the energy conversation. But definitely AI data centers are driving some of the energy demand. But for a place like India, which is short on land, and which has water shortages, those are other additional constraints that will have to be taken into account. So it's not just about energy. In fact, it could be that the energy piece of it will be the easiest to address. But like everywhere, there is this debate underway as to how much will these data centers actually, how many jobs will they actually create, what will be the resource drain as this AI race gets underway.
Right. The other thing sort of that stood out from this visit in terms of deliverables was the movement on investing in education. In many ways, the US-India conversation right now education has become the sensitive piece with a lot of visa and mobility issues, especially on students going back. And somehow that's also been seen as an opportunity in the India-Australia relationship. We saw Deakin, we saw Flinders, and Victoria University all setting up conversations on campuses in India, how this is more about talent and mobility and building future pipelines for various sectors. Do you think this is outside of the prestige play? Is all of this really scalable? And how long? What is the projection on that sector?
So the demand in India for education is extremely high. You have something in the order of 10 to 12 million students graduating per year from undergraduate degrees, right? So, I mean, massive demand. And traditionally, it has grown year on year. So the struggle has been even just to build capacity, and often at the cost of quality. Higher education is very, in some ways, over-regulated in India, and traditionally has been. Foreign universities were discouraged. The other thing is they were traditionally seen as training institutes, so there was not a lot of R&D done at Indian universities, unlike what you see in the United States or UK or even here in Australia. University of Melbourne does a lot of R&D as well. So these have been some of the gaps. You've seen some of the student protests in India. Partly that reflects that frustration of limited capacity, limited entry points into the higher education system, and then a sort of gap between the education training they do receive and the employment opportunities that follow. So there has been an attempt. It's unfortunately been too gradual over the past few years for India to open up this sector. And at first, it was just like in a few areas around in Gujarat, for example, in Western India, there were some deregulation provisions in a place called Gift City to sort of make it easier, make it more appealing for foreign universities. But most have been pretty averse to doing so. They find it over-regulatory. Instead, they've found it easier to attract students to those countries. Now, that's coming up against other constraints, immigration, budgets, things like that. And so you're seeing a drop in Indian students going to the United States, to Canada. It's mostly the Anglophone world has been favored, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Recently, there's been a bit of an uptick to the European Union, and many of the universities there have become more flexible, particularly graduate schools, of offering classes in English, for example, making it more appealing to Indian students, more vocational training as well. Australian universities have done something really interesting, and I think have been really pioneering in this respect. Which is they've actually taken the risk, which American universities and British universities have not been willing to do. And now you have 8 universities, the 8th one was just announced, setting up campuses in India. Many of them are starting classes only in the next few months. It's very exciting. A lot of them are focused on business, on STEM, so again, very vocationally oriented. The University of New South Wales, I think, is one of the latest entrants, which is quite exciting. So they're starting in a very modest way, and we'll have to see how they do in these places. They're offering degrees that are essentially similar, so similar quality, but starting small, which is probably the way to go. And the question, I think, as you rightly ask, is are these scalable? Will they actually inspire other universities to come through? Will they start moving, again, more from training to R&D? Because, again, that's one area that India has been traditionally more deficient in. These, I think, are all open questions. But I do think Australian universities have been, to their credit, much more innovative and less risk-averse than their counterparts in many other Anglophone countries.
Sure. Now, when we talk about education, we're talking about people-to-people ties. Indian origin Australians are now the country's sort of largest immigrant-born community. We saw this fantastic sort of event at the Marvel Stadium with the diaspora turning up and the Indian Prime Minister sort of encouraging folks here to, make the proof of concept of the business case of why India is such a economic opportunity for Australia, and translating some of those issues of the lack of familiarity with the Indian ecosystem. Now, when we talk about diaspora, and you and I have been in many rooms where, boards are talking about India as an opportunity, but really don't have a plan for India. How do you think the diaspora can sort of connect those dots? You have a large SME sector where India is doing very well in many cases. And, how do you build those linkages?
It will be interesting to see. This is a very large diaspora, 1 million strong, 4% population, but very new, right? So you don't yet see Indian Australians well represented in, say, Parliament. I think there are 2 senators, I think, of Indian origin, maybe one in the House, one in the lower house. So not very many. You don't see a lot in the bureaucracy, again, with some notable exceptions. You don't see a lot of business leaders and CEOs yet. Now, all of that will change as in the next 5-10 years, and you'll start seeing Indians, people of Indian origin, similarly to what you see in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere, in these leading positions of leading power. And so that'll be interesting to see how that translates. The other thing is, again, there will be some very difficult questions about integration that will also have to be dealt with. Probably, hopefully not publicly, but privately, and this is natural. There's been a drop, I think just in the last year, a number of Indian students here. You do see rhetoric from certain political parties in Australia that is already reflecting, again, some of that. So I do think that will be a sort of a concern going forward. But overall, I would argue the opportunities will outweigh, in the longer run, if managed well, will outweigh the benefits. And having, again, a strong cohort of people here who have, whether it's familial ties with India, have business ties, understand the environment there, will be very good for the bilateral relationship. It'll be that glue. And we've seen that, again, for all the talk about difficulties in the India-US relationship. There still is an Indian stake in the US growth story because of that glue between them. So I do think that will be done. But it is, again, at this very early stage where you've had this sudden increase in migration. There will be questions of integration and multiculturalism that will have to be addressed in various ways. But hopefully that will also translate in time to those Indian Australians doing very well for themselves here and being represented in a variety of ways. People may not know this, but Sam Kerr, the football player, is of Indian origin, actually. I was surprised to learn this. But, yeah.
Well, the other sort of conversation that you and I have had through the course of our meetings is on defense industry being this sunrise sector for both countries to consider. One is, of course, India's own sort of defense exports trajectory, what our ambition is, some of the lessons we've learned from both our experience during Operation Sindoor when India and Pakistan fought this limited sort of escalation. And the other side is, of course, the lessons that India has taken from the Russia-Ukraine war and, sort of double down on this project of self-reliance, especially in building defense capacity and capability. But in many of those conversations, I want you to address this in 2 bits for the audience. One is that still in many ways, despite the success India's had, for example, with the United States, in building out this partnership, Russia remains a conversation that puts a ceiling to many of these discussions. So I'd like you to address that for this audience. And 2, where do you think this defense industrial cooperation then will show real commercial results? First, sometimes I think what I've gathered from our conversations in Canberra is that India may have priority areas, but they're not necessarily aligning with what Australia wants. So where do you see the two meeting?
So defense, I'm going to spruik, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but this is an Australianism I've learned, which I really quite like. To sort of promote something I wrote for the Lowy Institute in 2020 on the Australia-India defense relationship. And if you look back on that was just 6 years ago. Even some of what I was, the reviewers said were too ambitious. We've not just met those objectives, we've actually surpassed many of them. And so I do think it's a really positive sign that the defense relationship has grown. Just to break down what that relationship is today, Australia and India have done over 20 military exercises in the past 5 years, Army, Air Force, Navy. These have become, particularly with the Army and Navy, have become very sort of annual affairs. And some of them have been multilateralized. So you have the Malabar exercises, which is with the Quad partners, the US and Japan. India's taken part in La Perouse with the French, in Talisman Sabre next year. So there's a number of military exercises that has really improved the military-to-military engagement. There's now a structure to the political engagement too. You have a regular 2+2 dialogue of the foreign defense ministers. Separately, there's a defense ministers dialogue, and there are joint staff talks between the military services. So there's now a structure to the security engagement. They just announced, this didn't get much attention, but there's a joint maritime roadmap that is classified that was finalized during the Prime Minister's visit here a few weeks ago. And I stress the fact that it's classified tells you a lot about where the relationship is, that they're doing things that they don't want to publicly talk about, which is a sign of the sort of trust there is in the relationship. There was a defense framework agreement signed in 2009. The new one was just signed. The new one is much more ambitious in its scope. One thing that is still pending is something called Provision of Defense Articles and Services, PDAS, an agreement. That should hopefully be concluded, and that will allow for essentially provide a pathway for defense co-production and co-development. Another agreement that was just signed was called PACTS. It's primarily a technology. It's not just an agreement. It's actually a mechanism for senior officials in 5 different areas, from India and Australia, to work together on joint outcomes. But 2 of them are defense-oriented. One is explicitly so. One is cybersecurity-oriented. So, even on the technology side, there is a pretty sizable defense component, with senior officials on both sides tasked to actually have markers and progress on these areas. So, all in all, quite a sort of an improved defense relationship. But a lot more can be done in 2 areas particularly, and that's what I'm particularly interested in. One is on joint operations, and that really depends on the threat perceptions that India and Australia have, similar but not identical, and again, geography is a factor. They have different priorities. So what are areas where, for all of this increased interoperability that we're seeing between India and Australia, and by the way, they're doing things like air-to-air refueling, they're landing helicopters on each other's ships, they're doing joint submarine rescue exercises, so it's a pretty robust relationship between the armed services. But there's still a few challenges to overcome. There's a communications challenge. They're still not using secure communications the way they should be. That's something that will need to be overcome soon. But where those joint operations are going to be, most likely, both Australia and India have very advanced anti-submarine warfare aircraft called P-8s. They both fly the same platform, slightly different variations of it. And so giving the ability of Indian P-8s to fly to mainland Australia, particularly northwest Australia, and the Cocos Keeling Islands, this will require some runway extensions there, would be one aspect of it. And reciprocally, allowing Australian P-8s to fly to mainland India and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So I think that's the ambition that can be done, and that will have very significant implications because it's right over many of the key choke points in the region. So that, I think, operationally will be one area where we I think, hopefully should see more, and the 2 countries will be working together. Another area is in defense industrial co-production, and it's been interesting for me following the debates around AUKUS from afar. In fact, again, to spruik another Lowy thing, I think there'll be a Lowy event in Canberra, which is a debate on AUKUS between two of our colleagues here, Sam and Jen. So I'll be watching that like watching a sporting event. It should be quite fun. But following the AUKUS debates from afar, it's been interesting to I think that sort of subsumed some of the other debates around defense budgets here. There will be only modest increases most likely in that. And then if Australia, because it doesn't have that strong defense industrial base, will look to scale up some of its domestic production, particularly new defense technologies. And so India does represent a partner in that. India is already a defense exporter. You have about 4 or 5 very successful defense companies there. And you're right in asking the question where should they focus on. Some are obvious candidates: missiles, interceptors, drones. These will what we're learning from the wars in Ukraine and Iran is these will become more important going forward. So those are the obvious areas. But I do think that there's some innovative areas where we can start looking at lasers, sensors, underwater capabilities, sonobuoys. These are areas where maybe less glamorous, but which both Australia and India will need going forward, and where you have again some very capable Australian and Indian companies making developments in that area, and the co-production opportunities are quite significant.
Right. But Dhruva, just again, putting you on a spot a little bit here. When we talk about all these, technology collaborations where sometimes you're talking about, underwater domain, where there are sensitive technologies involved. And repeatedly, when we've gone into rooms, you have had some people who have told us, well, using Russia is a lazy way to go about things. We've heard that piece. We've also heard that, well, this really does put a ceiling to how much we can collaborate. So for the benefit of the room, where you've also tracked the US-India defense relationship. You've seen how certain carve-outs were made there. We've also seen the conversation in India and the United Kingdom around sensitive technologies also going forward. So where do you think that path really lies?
Yeah, so I think what is striking for countries like Australia that are very well integrated in the US alliance network and therefore US defense production network and defense technological network is sometimes that for India, most of it, if you look at India's defense partners, it's the US, Israel, France, UK. Most of them are US allies. The one outlier is Russia. And that has often created these frictions that you speak about. Now, I'll just point you to a few things. One, the trend line is quite clear. Prior to 2014, 80% of India's defense imports came from Russia. Today, it's about 36%. So the trend line has been pretty strong that India is diversifying away, not always out of choice, but out of necessity, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine meant that supply lines were disrupted, India could not make payments to Russia because of sanctions. So it's just had to either indigenize some of those capabilities, which it has done with mixed success, and in other cases diversify to other sources. So that is a trend that is underway. To be honest, Russia does still continue to be important in certain key areas, and that is both legacy systems, particularly for the Army and to a lesser degree the Air Force and Navy, but it's there. There are certain technologies that Russia still offers which, say, the United States doesn't, so nuclear submarine propulsion being one of them. So Russia will remain in the mix, but it is diluting as a factor. The United States and UK and France have found ways to ensure that there's not technological leakage when they do exercises with India, when they do co-production with India, that there are ways to firewall that. It gets difficult in certain areas, such as integrated air defense, for example, is one particularly sensitive area. But it is possible, I think, in most of the cases, not all, to find workarounds for that. One of the challenges I've noticed just in talking to Australian defense companies, and I think we have a few in the room here, is sometimes they're more sensitive than the United States about the prospects of technological leakage to, say, Russia, or in India's case, China doesn't apply as much, but Russia in particular, more than the United States itself is. And I can kind of see where they're coming from, which is if there is that case, and they don't want to be left taking the blame for it, let headquarters take the risk. So there is sometimes a slight oversensitivity, I find, on the part of Australian defense companies in exploring some of these co-production opportunities for that reason.
Right. So we've spent a considerable amount of time talking about the opportunity. Now to sort of level that out, where do you think the risks lie in the Australia-India relationship going forward?
So I don't see too many risks in the strategic space. I mean, you have very aligned strategic visions for in terms of what Australia and India want in this global disorder that is characterizing the world, right? Both want good relations with a mercurial United States and are trying to figure out how to manage that and how to manage the United States resetting of the terms of its international engagements and partnerships. Both have concerns about China and Chinese assertiveness. Both, again, as I mentioned, are multilateralists. Both have concerns about terrorism. So strategically, I don't anticipate, unless one of two things happens, challenges on the people-to-people front. And we've had, again, episodes in the past that have been managed. Some of you may recall there were a lot of news reports about 10, 15 years ago about attacks on Indian students in Australia. It got amplified in the Indian media. And it led, that's just a minor example of it. But again, there is a growing immigration skepticism that is not by no means unique to Australia. It's happening everywhere in the world. So I think managing some of the people-to-people relations will require some careful treading and going forward. And that could spill over into the political realm. The second challenge is, I would say, business apathy or economic apathy, which is if expectations are not well managed, I've seen these cycles of like India hype and then India disappointment and India hype again and India disappointment. And the reality has always been a little bit more in the middle. So I think it's also been very good, when we have discussions with business leaders to be honest about what some of the challenges are. There are regulatory challenges in India, land acquisition, trade barriers, non-tariff trade barriers. Investment protections, corporate structures, things like that, and be honest about where those challenges lie. But I think if the business side can be managed, and particularly that's an expectations management bit, and the people-to-people side can be managed, I don't anticipate too many other wildcards.
Fantastic. Now that I've asked you all the easy questions, it's time to open this up. I request all of you who are raising questions to keep them brief and not make too long statements so that we can get more numbers in. Fantastic. I'd start with Mike Green here, please. Yeah, they're just coming right.
Thank you. Thank you, Dhruva. Terrific. And Shruti, congratulations to you and to Lowy. This is a very, very consequential investment and already paying dividends. Dhruva, you started by saying Australia and India live in a world of disorder. And then you and Shruti had a really in-depth and quite interesting discussion of the bilateral complementarities and opportunities. My question is, should Australia and India in these dialogues be thinking about how they shape the larger strategic environment? You and I have been in Japan-India discussions where that's 40% of the discussion, actually. And I think the opportunities are there, perhaps the Pacific, perhaps maritime security, ASEAN, the Quad. But what is the opportunity in this bilateral relationship to actually have strategic effects, to shape the dynamics in the region?
Thank you, Mike. Can we take a bunch of questions first, or do you want to go? I think I will take two more, if that's okay, Dhruva.
Sure.
Please, introduce yourself and keep your question brief.
Hi, I'm Pallavi Jain. I'm editor of the Australia Today. My question was that currently the FDI and FIIs into India from Australia are far below countries like Singapore and Holland. So how can that be corrected? And if there's going to be such, the economic convergence is, one could say, subpar. So how do we get to strategic convergence without that?
Okay. And one more, please. And I'll come to you. I'll do another round.
Thank you, Dhruva. I actually want to follow up on one of Shruti's initial questions, was the relationship with Russia. We talked about defence, but I also want to drill down on the oil side and to the extent to which that's going to put a cap on overall trade with Australia, not just defence, not just oil. If you could discuss that as well, just the sensitivities with the US as well.
Okay, strategic effects, FDI.
Three very good questions. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, Mike Green's known here in Australia. He's a celebrity in Japan, but he also played a big role in the U.S.-India relationship 20 years ago when he was at the National Security Council. So really great to see you again here. On shaping the regional and international order, I would look at sort of 4 to 5 aspects of it. And I would break it down geographically. Southeast Asia would appear to be the most easiest place for Australia and India to partner because of their geographical proximity to it, but it may end up being the hardest. And whether it's on questions of Myanmar, whether it's on questions on the South China Sea, you have a very crowded space already. You have an architecture of both, Penny Wong was just in the Philippines for the foreign ministers meeting of the ASEAN Plus meetings, East Asia Summit and so forth. I think it'll be really hard given that it's a very crowded space because ASEAN has its own way of working. There's some capacity building coordination that can be done, but it seems really hard to imagine. Both India and Australia have prompted ASEAN-led engagement with the junta in Myanmar. It's really not gone very far. It should be the area where there's most alignment. And while there is, I think, alignment at the top level, just translating that to making a difference is proving quite difficult. The second area where it might be more promising and more interesting is in the South Pacific, where Australia sees as its backyard. India has had particular relations with Fiji, given the large Indian population there, but it's slowly started to diversify and engage many of the other South Pacific countries, usually through small aid projects. India has these what are called quick impact projects. So you have very modest, like in dollar amounts, very modest, but small projects on public health, education, training in many of the South Pacific countries. Papua New Guinea is, I think, a little larger. And India's had not regular, but irregular summits with the leaders of the 14 PIF countries. The last one was in Papua New Guinea a couple of years ago. So there is, I think, some scope for engagement. One area I would look at, and it was specifically mentioned in the PACTS agreement between the Australian and Indian prime ministers, was digital public infrastructure. So finding ways to export India's digital public goods, and it's like the system of operating digital public goods in places like Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific. So that's an area where Australia and India can play very complementary roles. There have been some specific projects in Fiji on port development and in Palau on open networks, open RAN networks. But much more can be done in that space. Third, quickly, South Asia, one area not a lot of people pay attention to, but right now, actually, you had the commissioning in the Maldives of an Australian-provided vessel, offshore patrol vessel. So you had actually quite senior people from Australia Defence and DFAT out there in Maldives this week to commission a vessel there. So that exemplifies some of the cooperation that can take place there. And regular Royal Australian Navy deployments in the Middle East actually open up room for cooperation in South Asia and the broader region. Both are members of IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Again, another area for some. There have been some differences between India and Australia there, but also some convergence as well. Fourth, quickly, managing U.S.-China competition. A lot of that's around the First Island chain, working with Japan, Taiwan, others. I think that's a mutual area of concern, but again, limited what they can do there. Some of it is through the Quad. And finally, I'd mention multilateral cooperation at the UN, places like that. So I do think they can do some stuff to shape, but it seems like it's only in their backyards where they have the heft to do that, because otherwise when the US and China or ASEAN is involved, it tends to crowd out India and Australia. But a really good question and worth exploring further. On investment, I don't think it's fair to compare Australia to Singapore or the Netherlands. Both are effectively tax havens, and a lot of the FDI that goes into India from those places is really rerouted through from other countries, rerouted through places like the Netherlands, Mauritius, Singapore, Cyprus, places like that. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that. That being said, your larger point is absolutely correct. One of the things I've been trying to spend a lot of time with is meeting with institutional investors here. We had a video call with people, including some of the Australian supers. And some of it is, I think, just increasing what Ryan and Shruti and we've talked a lot about business literacy here. because again, sometimes there are somewhat outdated views of things. And again, the fact that a large Australian tech firm is making a big bet on India, but is being backed by Canadian and American investors rather than Australian investors, tells you again that the appetite for risk might need to change here. And by the way, being in Sydney, that affords a particular vantage point to engage on those issues. On Russia, look, India's engagement with Russia is really premised on three things. One is the strategic technologies. So traditionally, Russia was the supplier for India of defense, space, nuclear. It is no longer on space and nuclear the biggest one. In fact, you're seeing India cooperate more with NASA on human space flight, for example. Nuclear has opened up to other suppliers as well. Defense is slowly diversifying, but there's a long tail because equipment that India imported in the 90s, early 2000s, and has started to co-manufacture is still in the system and will remain so for a little while. But as I said, the trend is one of diversifying. If you look at the next generation of Indian subs, of Indian aircraft, Russian suppliers are not in the mix. The competition is really between French, German, US manufacturers in many of these areas. So it's still there. It will remain there. But as essentially Russia's role in India's strategic technologies is declining. But it's important to manage, particularly in the short term, given India's needs. The second aspect is a commodities relationship, oil being one aspect of it. And oil really, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, India imported less than 3% of its oil from Russia. It was only the cost increase that came with that and Europe's deliberate pivot away from Russian oil to the Middle East, which was India's largest source, that led to India actually, there were initially steep price discounts that Russia offered, so it was under the price cap. But that was a very coordinated approach. India actually coordinated very closely with the Biden administration and Europeans on ensuring that transition. So some of the public rhetoric you see about criticism of India from some of the same sources is somewhat self-serving. But the fact is, look, these are globally traded commodities, oil being one of them. It's not just oil, fertilizers, uranium, to some degree, palladium, diamonds, gold. Russia happens to be sitting on a lot of it, and these are globally traded commodities. When Europe is trying to not buy from them, it does become price competitive for India, and India's demands are increasing. So that is a very transactional relationship. It will persist because, for better or for worse, Russia does sit on a lot of what the world needs. One area India doesn't import a lot of is gas, and again, that's simply the geography, and unlike Europe or Turkey. Lastly, I would say one area of concern is the Russia-China relationship for India. And when you have a situation, February 4th, 2022, they declared a no-limits partnership, Russia and China. Putin went to Beijing for the Olympics. That caused a lot of anxiety in India. And when what had traditionally been one of your closest partners and your biggest adversary are saying they have a no-limits partnership. And that is playing out in some practical ways, right? We're now looking at Chinese integration into Russian defense supply chains. That has consequences for India. So I think managing that relationship is going to be very important in light of this greater Russia-China coordination. So Russia will remain an important factor for India, not always in ways that will please or the United States or Europe, but these are the realities that India has to confront.
Fantastic. I'm very aware of the clock ticking. We'll do a quick round. Ryan, and then Rachel, if you can end. And one question there.
Thanks, Shruti and Dhruva. Fantastic discussion. I'm Ryan Neelan, the head of the Centre for Australia-India Relations. You spoke, Dhruva, about the opportunities in defence cooperation and also in data centres and that side of the tech ecosystem. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the evolution in India's tech ecosystem from what many in the global economy is seen as a service outsourcing centre, including many Australian corporates, to where it is now as a centre of innovation and growth. What should Australian corporates know, and where are the opportunities? Thanks.
Right, and one question behind.
Jersey from Pacific Polarity and Crow. My question is somewhat similar to Ryan's in that, we in Australia, we had the recent budget and there was a lot of talk about its impact, particularly on business and tech startups. So from India's perspective, what are the risks and opportunities that it sees in this particular aspect?
Dhruva, speed round. speed up.
Those two?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'll combine them together in some ways. I mean, look, I think if you break down the tech sector, there are many sort of aspects to it. One easy thing I do is just follow the money. So I look at sort of where, like, for example, the Indian government has appropriated funding to back up initiatives because that, A, shows it's a strategic priority, and their intent on de-risking things. So look, and also you look at international partnerships because, again, that's another key area where you see where the priorities are. So I'd say defense has been very exciting. You have a lot new defense startup. Many of them are drones, but not exclusively. They're increasingly competitive. They're looking to incorporate overseas, they export. They're young, ambitious. Space is another. The 70 new space startups. India is I think only the third country that has a private company capable of space launch. But again, you look at any aspect of the space industrial ecosystem, there's now a company in India doing, again, very interesting, innovative, ambitious things in that space. AI, I think, is diversified. Again, a very big emphasis on AI applications. So that layer is very strong, and the data centers, less on the LLMs, which is very expensive, and where India remains quite dependent on particularly US-based companies, all the usual suspects for some of the foundational LLMs. But beyond that, there's a lot on the application layer where India is, again, there are a lot of small startups where that's happening. One, semiconductors and 5G, so the ecosystem, again, big emphasis, $20 billion or more, $23 billion in semiconductor subsidies that have gone into building out that ecosystem, mostly at the advanced testing and packaging layer of that. The fab side is still much more expensive and much more difficult. But 5G, India has, India went from being a laggard on 4G to kind of at speed global, on par with the rest of the world on 5G, and is now kind of leading on some of the 6G side, just again because of scale. So those are some exciting areas. One area that has been a bit disappointing, frankly, has been quantum. There is a national quantum mission, but it's very under-resourced. So I would say that's one area where it would be nice to see more, and where Australia, and including at ANU and other places, has some strengths. So that's one area, I think, where there's been some underinvestment.
Great. I think for me, when I started as India chair at Lowy, the idea really was to translate why some of this political convergence that we are seeing between both countries can have a stronger proof of concept, especially in the broader sort of public buy-in for the relationship. And I hope conversations like these that we've had with Dhruva today are one of many we'll continue to have going forward. So all that's left for me to do is thank you, Dhruva. I think we've had a terrific conversation and you've earned a really heavy lunch. But I thank you all for joining us at the Institute and hope to welcome you back soon. Thank you for joining us.